Well, hello, I'm Andrew Bacevich. We meet this evening after the Concert for Valor, held in the National Mall, funded by the likes of Starbucks and Chase Bank, featuring video tributes from celebrities like Tom Hanks and Oprah Winfrey, and including musical performances by Bruce Springsteen, Jennifer Hudson, and Carrie Underwood, among many others. I'm sure that it was a wonderful event, and I do not for a second question the motives of those who contributed their time, money, and talent to make it happen. But I could not bring myself to watch it. Many of you know of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor, theologian, and dissident killed by Hitler's regime in 1945. During the 1930s, Bonhoeffer decried the willingness of his fellow churchmen to accommodate the Third Reich. Those who did so insisted that they remained good Christians. After all, they continued to preach the gospel and to conduct the required liturgical rituals. They celebrated Christmas and Easter. They baptized, married, and buried. As a consequence, even though submitting to the authority of Adolf Hitler, they remained, in their own estimation, in good standing with God. Bonhoeffer famously called this cheap grace. Cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves without actually earning or deserving it. In my view, the relationship between American society and the United States military is shot through with cheap grace. The Concert for Valor was a manifestation of cheap grace, as the now seemingly mandatory tributes to soldiers that precede major sporting events, the videotaped reunions of returning soldiers that provide feel-good wrap-up moments to the nightly TV news, and of course the references to the world's greatest military folded into political speeches by any office holder above the rank of animal control officer. Well, mark down Ann Jones, our speaker tonight, as someone who is unimpressed by the cheap grace so liberally sprinkled about so that we Americans can feel good about ourselves. Ann is a journalist and photographer who has written extensively about violence against women and about war generally. She has reported on conflicts and on the aftermath of conflict from several continents. That reporting has found expression in 8 books and in countless articles for publications such as The Nation and the irreplaceable Tom Dispatch. Her most recent book, which she will discuss tonight, is not, frankly, for the faint-hearted. Its title is They Were Soldiers: How the Wounded Return from America's Wars. It actually offers much more than that subtitle promises. In direct, unsparing, unsentimental, but gut-wrenching prose, it tells the story of what happens to those who die in service to our country, to those who are wounded, to those who may return from war physically unscathed but otherwise shattered, and to the families who receive these returning soldiers who come from our battlefields. I have to tell you that as I reread They Were Soldiers in preparation for this event, I had to stop from time to time just to collect myself. It is very powerful, very moving, and very disturbing. the perfect antidote to the epidemic of cheap grace sweeping this country. But let's allow Anne herself to explain. Please join me in welcoming Ann Jones.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here, and how's that? I'm a little shorter. I want to thank the Patrick Lannan and the Lannan Foundation for inviting me to come here and be part of this wonderful series of events. It's a great honor to be here and a real pleasure. And I also want to thank Andrew Bacevich for that very generous introduction and for a great deal more than that. As you know, he has written a really brilliant series of books documenting the militarization of American life, documenting the abuse of American power and American forces, and the resulting corruption of our democracy. He makes plain the connection between home and abroad, between bold force projection, as they call it, and blowback. He writes of a whole succession of American presidents who have told us that America's great project in the world is to bend the arc of history to our liking in order to protect our American way of life. Reading Andrew Bacevich, you see that when you bend the arc of history, it looks very much like a boomerang. In his book, Breach of Trust, How Americans Failed Their Soldiers and Their Country, Andy quotes a line from George W. Bush in 2003. It's not a memorable line, but standard issue patriotic propaganda for the masses, the kind of red, white, and blue sloganeering that politicians slip by us all the time. As Andy dissects it, though, it becomes important. Bush says, freedom is worth fighting for, dying for, and standing for. Andy asks, who fights? Who dies? Who stands? He comments, the answer to this triad of questions impart to democracy much of its substantive meaning. I've written a little book that offers answers to the first two questions, who fights, who dies, and suggests some answers to the third, who stands, and that's what I want to talk with you about tonight. Of course, it is soldiers who fight and soldiers who die, and these days most people don't know why or even pay much attention. That's what breach of trust is about, and if you want to know how we came to have this deep divide between our modern, all-volunteer, high-tech military and the civilians for whom they supposedly fight, then you must read that book. And if you've already read Breach of Trust, read it again. It explains how it is that soldiers have come to pay the price for the folly of America's needless wars. So who fights? The soldiers I write about, you could say, have come back home on that boomerang, because I write about those who return on a stretcher or in a box or in an altered state of mind with enough troubles to last them the rest of their days. But when they first go to war, most of them are just kids. Most of them come from small towns in the South or the Rust Belt of the Midwest or big city ghettos. Many are following a family heritage of military service that has rewarded veterans of past wars with some special privileges, access to higher education, jobs, and a nationwide system of socialized medicine. But so many kids who enlist are so very young. Many are badly educated, knowing nothing of the world and how it operates. Many are immigrants, risking their lives to become citizens. Many are poor and short on promise. Many have such a slim chance of another job, another line of work, let alone a decent wage or a promotion. And because the Pentagon lowered standards to fill the ranks of the volunteer army, many are high school dropouts or gangbangers or neo-Nazi white supremacists or drug addicts or convicted felons with violent crimes on their record, such as kidnapping, rape, and murder. These are our foot soldiers, but to most Americans, these soldiers are somebody else's kids. What motivates them to volunteer? Some grab the chance to get away from home. Some are looking for job skills or just a job. Some can't resist the bonuses, the adventure, the prospect of themselves as heroes. Some want a ticket to college later on. Many want to do something for their country. Most of them are ambitious. They join up not so much for what they can learn or do, but for what they think they can become. So many kids in the country grow up with war games. In the backyard, online, in the arcades, and Hollywood films, posters and videos of handsome military heroes in dress uniforms. The Pentagon spends billions on advertising, public relations, and recruitment. And here's a shocker. It employs almost as many people to churn out this material as the entire staff of the State Department. These days, American kids are recruited for war long before they meet the actual uniformed recruiters at malls across America and in high schools that have bought into the Pentagon's JROTC program. That's Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps. I still call it JROTC. The Pentagon describes it as a kind of good citizens program meant to uplift high school students, especially in targeted educationally and economically deprived areas. But in 2000, then Secretary of Defense William Cohen told Congress that JROTC is, quote, one of the best recruiting devices that we could have. You have to remember that kids in high school are as young as 14 years old. Last year, the Department of Defense spent $365 million taxpayer dollars to supply military uniforms, military-approved textbooks, and retired military officers cum teachers to JROTC classes enrolling more than 550,000 students at more than 3,400 high schools, 2/3 of them in the South, one of them here in Santa Fe. You get the picture. There's no money to uplift lousy schools, but there's a blank check to shoplift as many undereducated kids as possible and get them into the fight. To this day, the Pentagon calls JROTC a youth development program. I call it recruitment of child soldiers. They don't kidnap the kids, they just bribe them with promises and go to work on their not yet fully developed minds. Once in the military, the volunteers are remodeled by training. As soldiers themselves put it, they are voluntold who to be and what to do. During the Bush-Obama wars, many have been bound by stop-loss orders that unexpectedly extend the length of deployment. Most soldiers have been deployed again and again and again. Many to 2 wars, although it's clear that multiple deployments increase exponentially the damage to a soldier. At the same time, reservists and National Guard members, America's weekend warriors who join up to help out when needed in their home communities, have been mustered and deployed to America's foreign wars. The trouble was and is a shortage of soldiers. The truth is that shabby and discouraging as life is for poor kids in this country, and hard as the Pentagon tries to recruit them, and as much as it lowers the bar so that even convicted rapists can be welcome to fight and die for freedom, well, the truth is that there just aren't enough kids in this country to match the imperial fantasies of the men we elect as presidents and the people, the unelected people, they choose to advise them. For some time now, as you must know, those presidents have been treating our soldiers like their own private militias, theirs to send out to do or die as the president himself and his cronies decide. Never mind that the president has no constitutional right to do this. So who dies? That would be mostly the kids we've been talking about, and others besides who come from the reserves and the Guard. Soldiers think of those who lose their lives as the unlucky ones. Their own stories are full of close calls. It took an extra measure of luck to survive when soldiers were ordered to drive the booby-trapped roads of Iraq in vehicles short on armor, or get out of their vehicles in Afghanistan to walk, on orders from a new celebrity general reviving an old failed game plan to win the hearts and minds of the people, forced to patrol on foot through fields where no Afghan farmer would go, both booby-trapped and laden with mines left over from earlier wars. The supremely confident and ill-informed architects of these wars have been a little slack in the planning, or so it seems to many soldiers who worry that their luck might be running out. Soldiers in Iraq in lightly armored vehicles lost their lives to IEDs. Soldiers on foot in Afghanistan were blown sky high, the bits and pieces sometimes lodged in the trees or rained down on the helmets of their buddies. A surgeon who worked on the human records of both wars said, "At least in Iraq, the injuries were still on the body." Soldiers gather up the pieces of the dead, put them in body bags, they always carry body bags, and quickly hand them over to specialists in mortuary affairs. They are kids too, girls and boys often just out of high school, charged with sorting the human remains and matching up the fragments as best they can, shipping them back to the mortuary at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware to be reassembled, if possible, cleaned up, dressed up, festooned with medals, and delivered to the next of kin. If the family of the dead kid desires, the Pentagon will dispatch, at no extra charge, a 2-person honor guard to fold the flag at the funeral and another guy to play taps. That is the end of the soldier, then. That is all there is. But there are other, slower ways for soldiers to become dead. We must think of them too when we face the question, who dies? We might think for a moment here of Thomas Young, who has written letters to the President and Mr. Cheney in the past about his sense of betrayal by our government Thomas Young, I hope you know, was volunteered just after 9/11, was deployed to Iraq. He wanted to go to Afghanistan. He was deployed to Iraq and was shot and paralyzed there in the first few days of his deployment. And it has taken him 10 years to die. So he just left us this past weekend, and also left on the internet for you to look up and read his last letter to Bush and Cheney. So, other people who die slowly. The mortuary affairs specialists, for example, when discharged, seem to enter a dimly lit afterlife of drugs, alcohol, violence, and suicidal ideation. Their job is to shield other soldiers from the facts of death. Mostly they don't recover from the secrets they keep. Then there are the wounded. The Pentagon works hard to save its soldiers, not just because it has too few, but because it fears civilians might take notice if the body count gets too large. They've built an extraordinary system of medical evacuation that takes a wounded soldier step by step through stages of rolling surgical interventions, from medics in the field to a medevac helicopter to a hospital on a major base in that country, to another medevac flight, a giant cargo plane, this time, like this one, to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and by ambulance to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center just down the road, the largest American hospital outside the United States. And then another giant medevac plane to Delaware or Texas, and the final lap by ambulance to Walter Reed or Brooke Army Medical Center. That whole journey might take just 3 or 4 days, with the wounded soldier subjected to multiple operations along the way, and the soldier who in any other war would have been among the dead comes home alive. Excuse me. This extraordinary system has held the total death toll of both wars to fewer than 8,000 soldiers. Private contractors have died in almost equal numbers. Compare that to the toll now being taken on the Afghan National Army, which has no such medical system. 100 dead every week on average. But the doctors who treat the American soldiers along the way and pass them to the next level of care ask, are they really glad to be alive? How does a wounded kid answer that question when he wakes up finally in Germany or the US to discover that his legs are gone, or his arms, or his genitals, or his urinary tract, or all of the above? A few days before, the soldier was as fit as he or she has ever been. The soldier can live on for decades, but never be that way again. Many soldiers lucky enough to escape the bombs and bullets break down from the sheer weight of the things they carry: body armor, weapons, ammunition, and a pile of odds and ends deemed essential to the high-tech soldier, stashed in a backpack that weighs well over 60 pounds, even before he adds 10 liters of water. The knees go first. The back crumples, the neck strains. Then the soldier is always in pain. Then come the drugs for pain relief, recommended by big pharma companies, and the experts who staff the various foundations for the study of pain funded behind the scenes by big pharma. They're mainly opioid narcotics, highly addictive, especially in young people, and often the first step towards suicide. The brain goes too. structurally damaged by concussive injuries or explosions, producing behavioral changes that can make the soldier seem a stranger to his own mother. One mother said, "I know my son is gone forever, but I must do what I can for this young man they sent back in his place." Metaphoric death can be as real as the real thing. That other mental problem, PTSD, is such a common complaint, the label applied so freely to cover all sorts of hysterical symptoms, that it may seem to civilians to be not so bad. But it may loose the demons of guilt and betrayal and self-revulsion that drive a soldier to death, suicide by car crash, or cop, or gun, or deliberate overdose. That is, if the cocktail of dozens of drugs prescribed by the VA doesn't accidentally kill the soldier first. So that's who fights and who dies. But that's not the full measure of the loss. Who suffers? Families, parents, children, spouses, most of the care of the wounded falls to women, many of whom have to quit jobs that served others. One mother, for example, who has taken care of her son at home since 2003, left a job as counselor to at-risk youth at a high school in a poor neighborhood in a big city. Don't think that didn't make a difference to the kids who needed her in their own way as much as her son did. The medevac doctors and nurses who bring the wounded home are mostly reservists with regular jobs in emergency rooms in the States. They worry about the extra load their absence puts on their fellow doctors and nurses back home, knowing it's the ER poor people rely on for what little health care they get. From such losses, then, the schools suffer and the students. The healthcare system suffers and the patients. The wounding or death of a single soldier ripples out through his or her community and far beyond, whether citizens are paying attention or not. Eventually, it hits us all in the pocketbook. The long-term costs of the care of disabled soldiers will peak around the middle of the century at $1 trillion or more. More soldiers than we like to think about bring the violence of war back home. They kill their wives or girlfriends or children. They kill fellow soldiers or random strangers, civilians. They work as hired hitmen for Mexican drug lords, taking out targets here in the US. They lay plans to take over their bases or blow things up, as Timothy McVeigh did in Oklahoma City, or assassinate the president and hand over the government to the Republican Party. That is not a laugh line, that was a real plot. Increasingly, such violent veterans will face off against others who have taken advantage of preferential hiring to join police departments across the country. Departments now sporting all kinds of military equipment, from armored vehicles down to tiny drones. Given such militarized toys, boys will be militarized too, as the whole world witnessed in Ferguson, Missouri. In fact, the whole country suffers when the boomerang effect brings home that military state of mind. It seems remarkable that since 9/11, the United States, the most powerful nation in the world, should have come to resemble in significant ways one of the least powerful countries on the planet, the one we have been helping with one intervention after another for decades. Afghanistan. That is not to say that the United States and Afghanistan are alike, but that many problematic similarities have become too evident to ignore. In 2001, the two countries seemed as different as night and day, but not now. Consider some things that now characterize them both. The powerful executive branch of government, the presidents behaving more and more like autocrats, seizing power assigned to others by the Constitution, or like warlords dispatching their private militias. A legislative body dominated by old fogies and money, where nothing much happens. Corruption at every level. The highest courts dominated by ultra-conservative men. Bank fraud and Ponzi schemes. Powerful, well-connected rich guys and massive poverty. The rich moving their money offshore. Ever-increasing inequality in wealth that makes a mockery of democracy, reducing it to the mere act of voting in fraudulent elections. Widespread unemployment, poor schools, inadequate health care, exorbitant and unsustainable military expenditures, mediocre generals and legislators. Women largely absent from public life, notably from presidential cabinets, though represented by some tokens. A war against women that aims to control our bodies, our sexuality, and our reproductive life, and thus exclude us from public life. Booming rates of violence against women and girls. Extraordinarily high rates of religiosity, commonly influencing public policy. Millions of weapons floating around and thousands of innocent civilians, including children, killed by guns every year. All these things the two countries now have in common. The differences between them seem to be not so much of substance anymore, but of degree. How in the world could this have happened? American presidents, intent on bending that arc of history, sent soldiers to fight to secure our American way of life, mistaking military might for foreign policy, and forgetting that it's the job of government, not soldiers, to provide, first of all, for the general well-being of all its citizens in equal measure. In Afghanistan, the U.S. has spent a few $billion in development aid on humanitarian assistance for healthcare, education, and the like. I'm not quoting exact numbers here because there aren't any numbers you can trust when it comes to these calculations. But we may have spent 100 times that much on developing an Afghan national army that supposedly is almost 20 times bigger than the biggest Afghan army in history. And by the way, none of the Afghan armies of history has ever come to the defense of the government that paid its salaries. And several of them actually participated in overthrowing the government. So this may not be as wise an investment as the Pentagon seems to think. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are said to have cost this country close to $4 trillion, almost all of it borrowed against the future, borrowed against our own children. As a result, the Afghan way of life is worse than it was before Americans intervened in their affairs, while our American way of life goes downhill. Many Americans not privileged to live at the top complain of a slow and steady slide. But from where I live in Europe, the descent looks more like an avalanche, picking up speed as it goes. And this disaster of our own making is now visible for all the world to see. What the world sees is that the United States has become the bully of the world, barging around in full battle dress, trying by violence to enforce its will on others, and unsurprisingly failing time after time, while triggering more violence all around. It was bad enough that the US years ago assumed the role of policeman of the world. Now we behave like an Afghan policeman trained by US profit-making contractors. An Afghan policeman who intimidates Afghan citizens and at gunpoint demands a payoff for himself. When a boy behaves like that in our schools, we kick him out. When a man behaves like that in our streets, we lock him up. So how does our government get away with this? As for that last question, who stands, that would not be the soldiers, but all those who stand to benefit from America's endless wars. And you can make the list yourselves, I'm sure. Presidents and their hand-picked advisors who send the soldiers, Congress people who abandon their constitutional responsibility to determine when military force should and should not be used, manufacturers of arms and weapon systems who reward the politicians with campaign contributions, and in turn are rewarded with renewed contracts. Standing also are the generals who misled the soldiers, now on the lecture circuit, and the private profit-making contractors, the mercenaries of our patriotic wars. In short, the whole intimately intertwined military-industrial congressional complex President Eisenhower warned us about so very long ago. And let's not forget the cheerleaders, the prominent journalists and pundits and talking heads and think tank experts, consistently wrong, yet like Congress, consistently rewarded. A career officer on a medevac flight from Germany to the US gave me an earful. He told me, war is a con. He wasn't just channeling Smedley Butler, the general who wrote that classic little book, War is a Racket. He was drawing his own conclusions after 26 years' service in the Army. He denounced military bosses and politicians and bankers and Americans in general who send the lowliest 1% to fight wars that make the other 1% on the high end, as he put it, monu-fucking-mentally rich. He told me to follow the money bags, magically leaping like trained frogs from the public treasury into the pockets of the already rich and powerful. I knew he was right about the money. The war on terror has brought us the greatest war profiteering in this country's history. And we all know about the billions that have just gone missing. But what struck me about this officer was that he put the blame for America's arrogant addiction to making war with all its boomeranging consequences, not only on the military bosses and the politicians and the money men, but also on Americans in general. That would be us. It's November, and as Andrew mentioned, we had Veterans Day yesterday with all those wonderful celebrations. But I think we need, rather than celebrating those veterans, to listen to them. And I have the pleasure of frequently listening to the poetry of Doug Rawlings, who, as I hope most of you know, was a veteran of the war in Vietnam and one of the original founders of that great organization, Veterans for Peace. And he is also a very fine poet. And he sent me this year's poem for Veterans Day, and I'd like to share that with you. Since veterans are holding us accountable, we should listen to what they have to say. This is entitled November Comes. November comes on to me like a C-130 slinking into Dover Air Force Base, laden with tin caskets, draped in red, white, and blue. I know I should just let this be. Maybe I can still do this, push my shopping cart down the local IGA's aisles, pick up cheese and wines and crackers while avoiding aluminum cans like the plague, pay the cashier, smile at the bagger, push the cart out into the parking lot, neatly place everything I just bought into the dumpster out back, light up a smoke, relax. Sure, you want me to join in on your celebrations, bless our bounty, accept your thanks for my service, as if I were some pilgrim come home to receive your grace. It is November, you say, and we set aside a day just for you to wrap up war with the dissonance of fife and drum and bagpipes blaring down Main Street, as if we can all finally dance to the same tune. Sorry about that. My dancing days are long gone. I'd rather skate across the pond alone. I have more faith in ice. Thank you.